but they also have to go through very specific rescue training that includes practice sessions at least once every year. So that's really important. And then one of the things that changed with the update of the role back in 2018 is this last section of making sure that the rescue team is going to be able to contact the employer when their services are no longer available. And so to answer the question of whether a local fire department can do that, potentially, but it would be, I have encountered fire departments that do not have the capability of doing that because they don't have the equipment or the specialized training to be able to perform confined space rescue. So it is really important. What I have seen sometimes happen is somebody have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, with the fire department, where the fire department does have all of that training, those capabilities. They can perform rescue for an employer, and they also have a preferred way to be contacted when somebody's performing an entry so that they know. And in the case that they are called to another emergency, they can contact the employer, let them know that their services are no longer available, and everybody can come out of the confined space. So that's really, really important. So bottom line is calling 911 without doing that evaluation is just going to be insufficient. And I'll just take a moment here to see if there's any other questions about that.
Yes, I have a question and also a statement, Laura. This is Rhett. Just so everybody knows, if you look online, you can see the technical rescue services that perform confined space rescue in Snohomish County, also King County, and beyond. So always look in your county to see online if you have any technical rescue services available that will service your area. And generally those technical services are available 24/7, and we'll state that online. It may also be necessary to contact a local fire department in your area. And so check that out. I think Snohomish County has like a 120 person technical rescue team that can perform confined space, but double check, verify. And also, Laura, the question for you is this. Say you are working in a remote location and you are performing permit required confined space entry, and you have a mechanical means of retrieval to effectively rescue someone. If the fire department is not available to perform entry rescue, but you have non-entry rescue equipment available, is that sufficient?
That's a great question, and that was actually my next slide here.
Awesome.
So yes, we're thinking alike. That's a good thing. So I get that question very frequently. And the reality is that whenever you're performing an entry through a permit system, you always have to have that rescue team available. The way that the rule is written is so that you have that always, but in the case that you can use a non-entry system, then you have to use that. And back to that saying of there's going to be instances in which that non-entry rescue system is not going to be feasible because it can create another hazard, right? Or maybe it's not just a straight drop down. Maybe you have angles that you have to run through, and people can get tangled up. And so the requirement is you always have to have that appropriate rescue team available. And then if you can use non-entry rescue systems, then you use those. But it's not either or.
Great, thank you very much. I also have one additional question on this. Is I'm running into this a lot on the east side of the mountains with other clients where they're working on developing technical rescue. I've had some fire departments involved in some of my confined space training that I've offered, and they're working on getting technical rescue for entry rescue available for different cities and municipalities. But we're oftentimes working in very remote areas of the state that may not have those resources available. So what is a feasible option when a rescue team is available that may not even be able to respond in an hour or more, even if it is available when that is a requirement?
Yeah. So what I have seen people do is just decide that they're going to have internal people that go through all of this training to become the rescue team. And that way it's going to be mobile and available at the locations in which they need. That is the simplest way to address that issue.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Okay. Um, so now going into alternative entry methods and what those are. As we can see in the flowchart, you can use alternative entry methods into a permit required confined space only if you have eliminated all the hazards, or if you have eliminated all of the physical hazards and controlled atmospheric hazards. And if we look at the specific language of the rule, essentially it's mentioning that if you remove or eliminate all of the physical hazards and you have potential atmospheric hazards, then continuous forced air ventilation is going to control the actual or potential hazards and maintain a safe atmosphere during the entry. And if that ventilation stops working, then the atmosphere will remain safe long enough for somebody to be able to safely come out of the space. And so this thing that really pops up here and that I get questions a lot is like controlling and elimination. And if they're, interchangeable and so on, they're not. They're two different things. Controlling is really using some kind of engineering method to reduce the level of hazard and then use that engineering method to maintain that reduced hazard level, exactly like ventilation. Elimination, really, the idea here is that even the possibility, the potential of a hazard is gone. It's removed, it's completely gone. As you can see, part of the definition of elimination of a hazard includes isolation. So really important to go back to the definition section of the chapter and look at what's included in isolation. And so things like double block and bleed, blanking or blinding, breaking a line and misaligning it, those kinds of things that when you think about it, if something fails, there's still not going to be this hazard coming into the space. So very, very important to keep in mind. What alternative entry methods involve is implementing procedures for safe entry, much like with a permit. You have to make sure that you're doing your evaluation of the hazards and eliminating them or controlling the atmospheric hazards. There's very specific language as to how to test for your atmospheric hazards and how to use that continuous forced air ventilation to keep that atmosphere safe. You have to make sure that the conditions for evacuation of the space are established, and then also that you do have written documentation for each entry that you're doing. So that's one of the things that I oftentimes see is that people assume that there is no documentation required for an alternative entry. And there is specific information that is required for that documentation. Here I have a template of a documentation form for this purpose. And as you can see, it's going to include the location of the space, the entry date, the entry duration, the list of hazards and how you eliminated them. And then if you do have atmospheric hazards, how you're using ventilation and monitoring to make sure that it's safe. And then, of course, any other conditions to keep the space safe, like when to evacuate. And then last but not least, an entry supervisor signature, somebody with the knowledge to make sure that all of these conditions have been met and the space is safe in order to enter. So always really important. One of the questions that I often get asked is, can I reclassify my permit required confined space to a non-permit space so that the regulation doesn't apply? And the reality is that we don't have language in the code allowing for reclassification to a non-permit space. So that changed in 2018. So where you are at that point is in this section of your flowchart. You have a permit required confined space. You're doing things to make it safe. and you're eliminating hazards, so you have an added level of safety versus just controlling. And so you can use alternative entry procedures. I know there's some confusion here because there used to be language to be able to reclassify to a non-permit space, but that former requirement also required documentation of how that was reclassified. So if you think about it, it hasn't changed too much with the exception that you're not reclassifying the space to a non-permit space. What it is that you are using a different method to enter the space compared to a permit. So always keep in mind that an alternative method is not a separate classification of a confined space. You have a confined space or a permit required confined space, and if you meet certain conditions, you can enter the permit required confined space you're using alternative entry methods. And then if we look at the scope and what applies here for alternative entry methods, pretty much everything in the rule applies with the exception of permit entry procedures. So you still have to identify and control entries, you still have to have a program, you still have to have employee training and implement your alternative procedures. Okay, so I think I will take a moment here for any questions regarding alternative entry methods.
Question.
Okay.
When the language says completely eliminate or fully control the hazard, when we look at construction, oftentimes we'll use inflatable pipe plugs or mechanical pipe plugs. Are those sufficient in elimination or fully controlling the hazard in your eyes?
That's a really good question. So those typically would not be considered elimination. They would be a control. So because there is some failure that could occur with these inflatable plugs, those would be something that you use to minimize the hazard. But though the use of those themselves is not elimination. You would have to think about it in terms of maybe the double block and bleed system, where you're blocking it in two sections and bleeding the space inside so that if there's a failure here, there's still the bleeding and there's still the other block that is not going to allow for that to happen. So great question.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so the failure of gaskets and equipment, that is not considered to be an unforeseeable situation, so it wouldn't be considered elimination if that's the case. Okay, so I just want to take a moment here to do a brief comparison of the entry procedures. So as we can see, both of them, you have to make sure that you're implementing procedures for safe entry. For both, you have to evaluate hazards, and then for permit, you can control them. But for alternative entry, you do have to, for the most part, eliminate the hazards. And then, of course, you have to use appropriate equipment to be able to do that. Both of them require some type of documentation. The permit procedures require a full entry permit, and then the alternative entry methods require a different type of documentation. So it's just slightly different, the information that you include in each of those. And then one of the major differences here is that for a permit entry, you do have to have that rescue and emergency services available. That is not something that is required under alternative entry methods, but for alternative entry methods, you still have to have establish a condition that would make somebody have to evacuate the space. Okay, and so I'll just briefly go over the misconceptions that I see. Usually it's alternative entry is a separate confined space classification, which is not. It's just a method to enter a permit required confined space. Oftentimes I see a lot of people think that because it's an alternative entry that the regulation doesn't apply, and that's not the case as we saw. That no documentation is required for alternative entries, as we saw again, that is not the case. I can always rely on calling 911 for rescue services. Not the case. You always have to make sure that you do the proper evaluation for your rescue team. And then also, I don't need to have a permit required confined space rescue services if I use non-entry rescue systems. So again, you have to have both. I have no responsibilities if my employees will never enter my permit required confined space. Sounds really basic, but I see that all the time, and that is not the case. And really, that's it. I have some resources for you. So I do want to make sure that everybody knows that the PDF version of the regulation has a ton of resources. It has templates for documenting alternative entries. It has 3 templates for permits. It has the written program template, and it also has a checklist for evaluating the rescue services. So that's only going to be in the PDF format and not if you look at the regulation through the legislative website. We also have confined space training kits through our website. They're really great, so I recommend them. And then I realize there's, mostly safety professionals who won't need consultation, but there is DOSH consultation services. You can contact them with questions if you need help, and they do help employers do evaluations of their programs or hazards, and that service is provided for free. So really great service. And that's it. Are there any other questions?
Questions, please, for Laura. Laura, that was extremely thorough and well put together presentation. Excellent work. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Hey, Laura,
thank you. Yes.
Can you send me the PowerPoint, and then if anybody who's online today wants to get the PowerPoint, I'll forward it on to you if you send me an email.
Okay, sounds good. I will do that.
That's great, and fantastic presentation, by the way. I did record it, but I got a little late start on the recording, so I'll put what I got on the Smart YouTube website a little later this afternoon.
That's great. Okay, I see a hand up somewhere, but I can't tell who it is.
It's Brandon with Turner Construction. Just curious, on an alternate entry, I get this all the time from my subcontractors. I just want to be able to speak clearly to them. On an alternate entry confined space, what is the level of training of the supervisor and the occupants? Does the supervisor require a higher level of training than the occupants?
Than the entrance. So it is going to be just making sure that the entry supervisor is going to understand their roles and duties for that particular entry. So that's a good question. So it's going to be not a higher level. It might just be a little different information.
And is that available somewhere on the on our website?
And actually, go to this particular slide, maybe. So that information for the training will be under section 400 here and all of the requirements.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sure thing.
It looks like there might be some additional hands. Maybe that's just an old one. No, Todd, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi Laura. Great presentation, great delivery. You obviously are very knowledgeable in this area. I have a question about whether or not you have thought about, or anybody is talking about in terms of rules, possibly an entrant fitness evaluation. I know it's not part of the, I ask because I came across a couple cases where workers died last year, 2022 in Washington, and both died in confined spaces, and the ME determined that in each case they died of natural causes, one of cardiovascular event and one of heart attack. So, they go into a confined space, they obviously have some pre-existing health condition, and then either, the stress of being in the space or something, I think, contributes to them having what is then determined a natural death. And I just wondered if it might be something to consider, whether or not people who are designated entrants be evaluated by, say, a third-party independent medical evaluator or something like that. Because I know that if I were, not in the best of health, I would maybe not want to go into a confined space and have that happen.
Yeah, no.
Have any thoughts on that?
So we don't have that requirement, and
Right.
because the rule was updated so recently, I don't think that there's any intention of updating that particular regulation. I don't know, and I could find out actually if that was something that was considered when the rule was updated. That was before my time here in technical services, so I can look into that and see what was considered with regards to that for the rule. But of course, I think one of the important things would be to make sure that the conditions that you have in the confined space are going to be safe, but also that your entrants will be able to perform their duties.
Yeah, I don't think that there are restrictions on that type of evaluation. Once somebody is hired, and if it's a requirement for the job, then the ADA and equal opportunity employment restrictions don't apply because it's required.
Yeah, and I guess that really, as far as what we would have control over, it would be more of the safety around the space itself, right? And making sure that that is going to be okay for somebody to enter. But you're right. There are questions about ADA and other maybe medical evaluations, but that's not something that is part of this particular rule.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks.
Additional questions for Laura? Anybody? Laura, we've had great feedback on this. A lot of people appreciate your information today. If there's no additional questions, we'd like to thank you for joining us and for your time. It's been very valuable. And we also, I'm going to pull up my presentation here and show you guys the next meeting that will be held will be on May 10th, 2023, 9 a.m., same place. So please join us